This week on Life and Faith.
If the G-bomb is too flammable for you, I would just say, try some practices, try some rhythms, sit on the edge of a community and see how you feel about it.
Some of them expressed their thanks to Richard Dawkins for bringing them to Christian faith.
This led to the Brexit vote.
Personal growth, service, helping people, they're the things that are of benefit.
And they weren't able to help me.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
Elizabeth Oldfield is a writer and host of the wonderful podcast, The Sacred. It's full of searching conversations. She's interviewed just in a wish list of CPX interviewees. Nick Cave, Jonathan Haidt, David Brooks, these kinds of people. Also, for 10 years, Elizabeth was the director of Theos, a UK-based think tank that focuses on the place of religion in public life. It's a bit similar to CPX in lots of ways. We've had Elizabeth on the podcast before, as well as other people from Theos. Elizabeth appears regularly in the media, including at the BBC and in The Times, The Economist, Prospect and other places. She authors the Substack newsletter Fully Alive.
Yes, and Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times is also the name of her book, which I absolutely devoured. That title was pure clickbait. How can you not want to read that?
Sure.
And since Elizabeth left Theos in 2021, I've been watching her life with a lot of interest because when you're a supposedly former achievement addict like myself, you can tell you're not necessarily former when someone does the unthinkable to you, as in resigns from their stable, secure job for the great unknown. And, you know, my response is like, what? She did that? A line from her goodbye letter that I'll post in the show notes will give you a taste of how she thought about this. Elizabeth wrote, "I'm not leaving this job in a way that follows an approved path, namely by jumping into a bigger, flashier role or having an already polished new project to point you to." So she basically stepped off the career track and embraced the unknown.
And so in this conversation between Elizabeth and Justine, we get to see the fruits of what Elizabeth has been working away at. Now, the title, Fully Alive, Justine, I'm sure you wanted to know what lies behind that for Elizabeth.
Yeah, this is where the conversation started. I wanted her to point to some concrete experience that when she thought about it was like, yes, exactly this. This is what it means to be fully alive.
You're the first person who's asked me that, and it's a great question. I think the one that's coming to mind because it's very recent was yesterday evening, and we live in a sort of very small intentional community, which is one of those sort of jargon words, but it really a kind of a micro monastery or a place where more than one family are trying to live in interconnected ways. And we have a really strong value around hospitality, and so we often have a big table of people from all different walks of life, from places we have met them, who don't necessarily know each other, and we put them around a table and try and make a beautiful vegetable-based feast for them. And last night there was a moment where we were in the middle of one of those dinners and there were people from all different walks of life who might not have otherwise met each other, different religious beliefs, different political beliefs, chatting and talking. And my daughter had been helping cook, and I'd just given her a cuddle and she'd gone off to bed because she's just getting old enough to want to be involved. And I knew in a little bit of time we would invite people to come down to our little chapel and pray this ancient prayer called Compline, which is monastic prayer by candlelight, which has felt like a really easy way for people who might not be familiar with prayer to listen or just be curious or just be invited to observe something. And there was some Joni Mitchell playing in the background, and I was picking up some plates, and I came and stood in this big open plan kitchen with these plates, listening to Joni Mitchell, and had that overwhelming sense of rightness, of interconnection, of being connected with my own soul and with the people around me and with the love of God beyond me and with the kind of life I want to be living.
I have a very I don't mean to be flippant question to ask, a very short question, then I'll ask a longer, more serious one. Number one, Is everyone an extrovert around your dining table? How do
That's what
introverts cope?
everyone asks about community. So of our housemates, I'd say 3/4 are extroverts. And we have one particular housemate who is quite a strong introvert and needs cave time, needs alone time. But she's quite a social introvert. So she really does love people. She just needs to be quite boundaried. Like after a dinner like that, she'll need a certain amount of time to recharge. But when we invite people, we say, this is going to be a biggish group of people and you won't know everyone. And that's not a blessing for everybody. So it probably self-selects about who comes. But then I think even introverts, the idea of being invited to someone's house that you don't know very well, not for any particular agenda, just for its own sake, because it is good to gather around tables and break bread together. Not everyone.
So I read about your enormous table in your book, Fully Alive, and you can fit something like 18 people around it, I believe.
It's a squish, but we can.
And you've said already that there's something really rich about having all these people who have different understandings of the world, different things that they hold dear, that are sacred to them, gathering together for this big meal. I'd like to hear more about why that is so important to you.
I'm not sure we ever fully know why what's important to us is important to us, but my sacred value is relationship, is this sense that we are not really individuals, that we are interdependent and interrelated. And my sort of nerdy theological reason is because of how I understand God and how therefore humans are made. But very practically, it is just my vision of what a good life is and how we flourish. That is together, and together even when it's tricky, and together long term, and together in ways that require some vulnerability and courage, and that where we share care and we share capacity and we weep when each other weep and celebrate when each other celebrate. And it's not actually something we have modeled to us very well, I think, in our culture. And so something as simple as just an open table dinner regularly where people know they can come as a habit and a ritual that we don't have to decide to do. There's no super big build up to it. It's not stressful anymore. It's not like carefully curated as a guest list. It's just dinner, and you'll meet who you meet and you'll have some interesting conversations. And that feels like one very tiny way of modeling a different way of being in the world.
So how do your guests react when you've invited them to your garage converted into a chapel for prayer? And it's something that seems very ancient, I suppose.
Yeah. You know what? It's been really surprising to me how much people love it. And I will be honest with you, Justine, it did not start as some sort of strategic plan of witness. It started because people were having such a good time that we couldn't get them to leave. And
This was the way to get them to leave. Come to church.
No, it was, we're going to go pray now. And we were already having these kind of monastic rituals and rhythms of morning prayer several times a week. And we would pray compline amongst ourselves often after dinner or, but in a much more ad hoc way. We didn't have a every Monday night we will pray compline rhythm. So I was like, if we instigate that, it will give us a break point in the evening. And so it started as a way of saying, thank you for coming and good night. We are going to pray now. But I didn't feel like I could say, please leave so we can pray. And so I instead said, we're going to do this slightly weird thing, which is a very short monastic prayer. And we haven't got any electricity in our shed chapel. So we will be taking candles, and it's very dark down the bottom of the garden. And I know that all sounds weird, but if you want to come, you're so welcome. But otherwise, good night. And 10 people who in no way would describe themselves as Christian were like, sure, that sounds fun. And since then, some people are like, I do not pray and I do not want to be in the vicinity of it. And then they just hang out in the kitchen and it's lovely. And one time we came back and it turns out someone's a jazz pianist and he was just jamming away on the piano. But a lot of people come and just listen or just appreciate the stillness. And actually a surprising number of people join in. And it's a very interesting moment to hear someone say words that they are strange in their mouths and they are not sure what they're making of them, but they want to be part of this random little ritual in the bottom of a garden in South London.
I wonder if now's the time to say that I believe you could have very easily been part of the liberal elite who's kind of given up God along with all the other traditions, right, of an older world. You've got your New Yorker subscription, you're highly educated, you worked at the BBC in Westminster, but then you became a Christian. And now it seems you spend your time acting as a bridge, I suppose, between quite different worlds. And you probably sympathise very deeply with the spiritual search that plenty of people who aren't going to walk into a church still seem to be on. Can you tell me a bit about that?
It's funny, I reacted a little bit when you said the liberal elite, because I sometimes describe them as like the much maligned metropolitan intelligentsia, because I think it is easy for us to use these terms to write off whole groups of people. And also they're all kind of fictional, aren't they, really? I very strongly believe that every human being is precious and valuable and made in the image of God. And as soon as we let ourselves be contemptuous or disdaining of groups of people, even if they're really unlike us and they hold different political positions or different religious positions from us, we have harmed our own soul, like let alone what it's done to our relationship with them. We have disconnected from our calling, I think. So yes, I feel very, very grateful to have ended up in this, like through a series of strange accidental events in a tradition that is extraordinarily life-giving and liberating and humane. But seeing how the public narratives about it are very different. My experience of this path is so different from how it's perceived from the outside. And, you know, from my background at the BBC and the work I've done in think tanks and just the kind of people I'm drawn to, frankly, I'm mainly in relationships with people who would not touch Christianity with a barge pole and think that if they walked into church, they would be judged for a whole range of reasons, or just think it's boring and irrelevant and outdated and dusty, but who are, like all human beings, have metaphysical yearnings and are often lonely and want to make meaning and find places to belong. And I think particularly now, you know, this theme of like, it does feel a bit like the end of the world, and maybe every generation thinks that, and how could we possibly know that? But certainly what you can say is the ambient narrative is kind of apocalyptic, and that forms us in certain ways. It can make us more anxious, it can make us angrier, it can divide us from each other. So I see a real uptick in spiritual hunger and openness, and I just want to be alongside in conversation with people who are asking those questions.
You went there, Elizabeth. You've brought up the apocalypse. As I read Fully Alive, I felt like my heart was constantly in my mouth. I felt, I guess, exposed and raw because you went there, you said climate anxiety, you said a fraying world, you said corrosive individualism. And I didn't realize before reading this book that I wanted something that was well-versed in Brené Brown and deeply rooted in a faith tradition. So it was a way of being able to kind of like go to vulnerable places and linger there and yes, be afraid, but also still sit with that and not try and numb the feelings. So if I felt like that reading this book, what did it feel like writing it?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know how to feel about it. Responsible. I mean, I think it, you know, most writers do want to make people feel things, but for a purpose, right? Honestly, it felt so good to get honest with myself. And I think these fears that rise up in us that we receive from the world around us, I'm so tempted to distract myself. I'm so tempted to be in denial. I'm so tempted to be like techno-optimist, you know, we can fix it. My life in general is pretty lovely, right? And so thinking about the fact that for billions of people, life is not lovely and not likely to get lovely if we keep on the trajectory that we're on is something you just have to treat with a bit of care. But if you never look that stuff in the face, I was finding myself like disconnecting from myself and not being honest, right? And I think the joy of writing the book was the feeling very turbulent and at times distressed. And what have we done? How do we pass this world on to our children? Why can't we get on with our neighbours? Why can't we act with justice towards the most vulnerable in the world? You know, that actually I had already received what I needed. I had already landed by grace in this story, which is steadying, is a story that has been told and passed on through generations of Christian believers who also felt like it was the end of the world, right? When the plague wiped out half the population, or, you know, when the Huguenots were massacred and had to flee. Again and again, congregations have had to go, is this just a nice ethical frame for my life that I can have on the edge of my kind of prosperous middle class existence? Or is this actually rigorous, apocalyptic, wild, rich story about a God who comes into history and calls us to be growing into the kind of people who can love their neighbor even in apocalyptic times, right? Who can steady themselves, who can be like trees planted by streams of living water, who do not fear when the drought come, right? Who do not fear when the floods come, who can be people who are not reliant on comfort and convenience for their own steadiness of soul. And it was that, oh, thank God, like, I don't know how to fix climate change or geopolitics or the changing cultural tides, but I know what I'm called to do, which is put my roots down deep into love and be growing up. Like, grow up is what I see in my scriptures. Grow up. Be becoming the kind of person that the world needs. And this is how you do it. And this is the help you're going to get. And this is the kind of communities you need to build to do that. And generations before you have done it. And it was so like relieving to go, it's not that someone's waved a magic wand and everything's suddenly easy, but this is what I can do.
And I suppose, I mean, you've just said it right at the end there, that you didn't have to first get brave and then go do it. You have to just jump, right?
Yeah. And the line I use is like asking my faith to take more weight than I had yet been brave enough to let it, you know? Like, if I stake my whole life on this, can it bear that weight of longing and the need for meaning and that like very flammable hope that there might be unconditional love beyond us and that we can be forgiven? All those things are like, I can feel myself. It's an emotional firestorm in all of us, particularly if we're not someone who has received a tradition that says that, or maybe we did receive it and we've rejected it and walked away from it because it had lots of challenges around it. But deep down, I don't think any human being does not long to be loved unconditionally by someone beyond us, right? Not another human. Yeah. So the book was like a very vulnerable making process of trying to let myself think what I really thought and then write it honestly and try not to worry about what people would think of me. And then realizing how I'd sort of preached to my own soul, and that was medicine for me.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're hearing Justine's interview with Elizabeth Oldfield about her book, Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times. Justine goes on here to ask Elizabeth to try to distill some of the things that writing this book taught her. What medicine for the soul did she discover?
So there's kind of two ways to go at that. And the book very deliberately starts with the things that are most accessible for everyone, because I call the sort of ultimate question the G-bomb. The thing at the heart of all of it for me, the love of God, is really a hard place to start for a lot of people. And I don't think you necessarily have to. And so what I'm trying to offer is actually, particularly where I'm from, in my like cultural milieu, people are very into ancient wisdom, but not this ancient wisdom.
Oh, you mean like people are into the Stoics? Is that what you mean?
Stoics, Plato, Buddhism, even like Sufism, Kabbalah, anything that's like old but not Christian. And not to mock it, there's loads of good stuff in there. And this is what I mean. People are just desperate for wisdom, hungry for guidance, but not from there. And that's, frankly, I think the fault of Christians. We have like terrible communicators. And Alan de Botton says the most off-putting thing about Christianity is the insistence that you eat everything on the plate. And there is a sense in which we're like, all of it or none of it. And I'm just trying to be like, or we could just let people start somewhere. And honestly, even when the G-bomb question, even when my faith feels, and I hope everyone has this, feels challenged or unsure, or I'm in a dry patch.
Oh yeah, every day.
Yeah, the rituals and rhythms, I'm still like, yes, this is healthy, this is good. And so we live in this sort of monastic inspired community, and we have a rule of life, which is what the monks called basically a way of structuring your time to stay loyal to your values. And so I get up and pray with my housemates. I would not naturally. I hate mornings. I've never managed it for myself. But if there's people waiting in the chapel, I will get up and pray. We have this rhythm of hospitality, and we have structures of our life, rituals and rhythms that keep reminding me of this story I want to root myself in. I go to church and it reminds me to be grateful, not naturally grateful. It reminds me to reconcile with people who I'm pissed off with. I need reminding of that. It reminds me to give some money to people who are not as well off as I am. And that is good for my soul. I think of it like scaffolding. Setting up your life so you're not every minute of every day having to decide to do the things that your values are telling you want to do, but just getting in a communal situation where you are together trying to grow in the same direction. So really, liturgy in church as a sort of spiritual technology for holding my soul when my soul is unreliable is a key way I steady myself. Confession, honestly, when I'm like, what have we done? Why are humans so terrible? That confessing my own part in it, confessing my own prejudices, my own tiny hatreds and resentments, my own greed, my own failure to lower my standard of living in any meaningful way. So these very sort of basic things, I came to see them anew, not as something we just did out of habit because we received them as a cultural background noise, but because there is a psychological astuteness to these rituals and rhythms and practices. So that's the kind of way in. If the G-bomb is too flammable for you, I would just say, try some practices, try some rhythms, sit on the edge of a community and see how you feel about it. Obviously, the big question, the biggest medicine for me is sitting in presence of a loving God who I am learning to trust holds all of this mess and is not ignorant of it and is at work.
I wondered if you can talk to me about attention and prayer, because your book goes back to it all the time. And you even started this conversation by talking about a prayer chapel at the bottom of your garden.
Yeah.
I feel like in a world that is so preoccupied with the new and the flashy or the innovative, in spite of the appeal of ancient wisdom, prayer and attention feel a little bit humble. They feel a bit slow.
Yeah.
But you say that in some ways they're the hidden genius of religions.
Yeah, Rowan Williams says, we kind of think of religions as places that can give us ethical guidance, but we forget that they actually help us structure our time and our attention in the direction that we want to grow. And yeah, I increasingly think attention, what we choose to attend to is who we become. And it's a sort of cliche to say we live in an attention economy, but resisting the formative power of a culture that sort of wants us completely scattered and distracted, just pinging around, responding to stimuli. All the studies show that meditation does this too. Anything that forces us into a state of focused attention is good for us. It's sort of how our minds were designed to function. Not all the time. Sometimes we do need that very responsive, fight or flighty, quick decision making. There's the sort of thinking fast and slow thing that Daniel Kahneman, the social psychologist, talked about. But we at least need a very good dollop of steady, focused attention. And you can think about this in neuropsychological terms of how, our brains are plastic, which means they're very changeable. That the things we repeatedly pay attention to form our neural pathways, and they actually make it possible to see things. Or if we don't pay attention, they blind us to things. They make it impossible to see other things. And so Ian McGilchrist, who's this psychiatrist and writer who writes a lot about different forms of attention, says attention is a moral act. Basically, what you choose to attend to is who you will become. And prayer, for me, is like an anchor for my attention or a compass. Even when, frankly, I'm just doing it out of habit, my brain is not on it, I'm distracted. Some days I don't even know if I believe it, but it's like, this is where I want to anchor myself. This is where I want to root myself in faith and hope and love, in a posture of love for my neighbor and gratitude, and in the hope of the resurrection. That is where I want to root myself. And so it is as much a choice about who I want to be becoming as it is something that I'm sort of ticking off my list that I should be doing spiritually, because I'm not very motivated by shoulds. It doesn't really work for me.
Elizabeth hosts The Sacred, a podcast featuring amazing, deep conversations. And they all start with the question, what is sacred to you? So I asked Elizabeth about cultivating the space to ask the kinds of questions that wouldn't often be asked in the secular mainstream.
This is going to make me look bad as someone who is not at all strategic, but that was not what I set out to do. We used the phrase, what is sacred to you, because it is very deep in the peace building and reconciliation tradition. There is a book called Talking to the Enemy by Scott Atran, And he uses this phrase, sacred values, to mean non-instrumental values, that you need to understand what's going on in a conflict, because if you try and offer someone money, you try and like have sort of fair apportion of interests, when there's sacred values at play, you will make things worse because you will insult someone. You know, if I'm like, I'm really sorry that I desecrated your war memorial, Justine, here's some money. Actually, the money's not going to help. An apology might be much more effective. Like a genuine apology. Sacred values need acknowledging, even if you can't affirm them. That's what de-escalates conflicts, with sacred values in them. And so I started asking people what is sacred to them, purely out of, I'm creating a sort of peace building and reconciliation project. And that's obviously grounded in my theology and the Christian nonviolent tradition, but it wasn't explicitly meant to be a religious podcast or have any really like very strongly spiritual angle. But something about the question, because it does have these associations with religion essentially, and because it was a deep question, it was a beautiful thing to see people feeling like they could vulnerably reflect on what they believed, what they had believed, what they wanted to believe, what their understanding of a good life was. And again, I get people coming on the podcast who are like, oh, I'm really looking forward to talking about God. I never get to talk about God. I don't know what I think of God. I used to think, and just like, I'm like, okay, great, let's go for it. But yeah, creating the space and the curiosity. And I think the key thing is I am doggedly non-adversarial. I'm never going to try and tell someone they're wrong or why they should believe what I believe. I'm just going to listen. And that is the conditions, I think, for self-reflection that people don't often get offered, and it's a very precious thing.
I've heard you say on the podcast that you tend to connect with clever middle-aged men who seem to be teetering on the edge of belief in God, even if not quite embracing it for themselves. And I suppose I've noticed that too in terms of people who have come to Christianity in recent years. I think of David Brooks or Paul Kingsnorth. But I'm wondering whether you're finding the same with women.
More recently, yes. Often via feminism, actually, via a kind of sense of the way our sexual and dating culture and the way we think about gender is going at the moment. A few key people, I'd say that's their trajectory, kind of like having really felt like religion was the enemy as a feminist, coming to see it's not necessarily the case. And in the younger generation, definitely it's more kind of gender equal. I wonder if the sort of, 40s and 50s generation of women were still in their formative years, really, where the public narratives about women still did feel, it was women have only been allowed to be priests in the Church of England in my lifetime, right? That the idea that Christianity might be somewhere you would go looking for wisdom is just a harder pill to swallow for a particular generation of women, in a way that those coming through in their teens and 20s just don't have that history and are frankly, I think, more aware of how perilous the future looks and very aware that the sort of alternative path, which is, just work hard and pass your exams, look hot, get a great career, buy a house, get a kitchened island, have some kids, go on some nice holidays, put it all on Instagram, is neither actually for most of them possible because they are locked out of the housing market. The dating pool is disastrous. Yeah. The like nice, safe middle-class life is maybe not going to be possible. And also no one looks that happy who has managed to achieve those things. Right, once you get to know them, that those things in themselves are not the route to contentment or existential satisfaction. And so, yeah, I'm seeing that generation. And in a way that you're seeing it isn't like, they also got very interested in tarot. They've got very interested in astrology. We're seeing that spiritual openness like across the board. But my hunch is that the potential that Christianity might have something to say in that space is also beginning to bubble up. Frankly, it depends how Christians react and whether the church can sort of be relaxed and curious and open enough to welcome people with their questions. That is my hope that we can, but it could go either way.
So you were previously the director of Theos Think Tank, which I suppose is almost like a second cousin type organisation to CPX. And in the book, you write about how when you wrote your letter of resignation, that it clearly touched a nerve. Can you take us through what happened there?
Yeah. I should be clear, I haven't fully left Theos because the Sacred is still made by Theos, which is wonderful because I get to be affiliated. So, and this is where, if this is not your experience, I start to sound really weird. But I felt very strongly led to leave in a way that I don't get a lot of sort of divine guidance that's very clear in my life. There's a lot of, I think, more general guidance, but the like, do this, counterintuitive thing. Leave this great job that you like, which provides financial security for your family. And it took me a while to kind of go, okay, I want to take that seriously, that I feel like I am being led to leave this job, but I didn't have another job. And I sort of felt very clearly that I wasn't supposed to get another job. I was supposed to rest because I was quite burnt out. And so I said that. And I am sort of reasonably honest person and increasingly just deciding to say the honest thing. And the honest thing was, I am leaving this job and I don't know what I'm doing next. And I'm supposed to give you some sort of great project, or I'm supposed to say, look, I am onwards on the trajectory up and to the right of a successful life. Because that's what you do with jobs and professions. You want to kind of have your reputation burnished. I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to leave and have some rest and try and work out what to do next so that I can actually be useful. And it was remarkable how the number of people who messaged me to say, I didn't know you were allowed to tell the truth. I didn't know you were allowed to be honest. No one ever says that unless they're a politician who's been caught having an affair. And it's code. I'm going to spend some more time with my family. It's code for I've been disgraced. And Jacinda Ardern, a few years later, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, sort of said something similar, like, I'm too tired to do this job well. And it felt so humanising to acknowledge our limits, to acknowledge that we need rest, that we are fragile, and that life is not always up and to the right, and that's okay.
I asked Elizabeth what she would say to someone, like me, who still believes that success looks like career advancement. What does someone like that risk missing out on if they don't heed the call to stop, if they receive one?
The obvious thing is your health. But I think more seriously, the life that we are called to. My definition of sin is disconnection, and my definition of fully aliveness is full connection, right? Full, integrated, relational connection with our own soul first, right? The Freudians talk about the id and the superego and the ego. And in my tradition, we talk about the flesh and the spirit and the soul and the body, right? That there are things at war within us. But there is something deep in us that is designed for love, that is designed for a life of connection, that is designed actually for freedom. Freedom from all the shoulds, freedom from all the performing for anyone else, freedom from having to earn our value or be anything other than a beloved child, already beautiful and just wanted and known and seen. And any life that we're living that sort of numbs or distracts us from that part of ourselves and instead is sort of performing for other people or jumping hoops because we're scared or looking for our security in possessions or circumstances, it disconnects us from ourselves. And so I'm as prey to it as anyone else, but the more you make choices that are just a little bit radical, the easier it gets, and it actually gets quite fun. Like, I'm just now really quite a weirdo, and all the saints of my tradition, I love the medieval mystics. I think Jesus was a massive weirdo, and that's why he's so compelling. And so I think I would just say, try and be brave enough to make one decision toward your own soul and what the life it longs for, and then just see what happens.
I think what you're, pioneering is the exit from consumer capitalism, that if everyone did it, GDP would go down the toilet, but maybe we wouldn't trash the planet. So,
Yeah. I mean, I should be really clear what a complicit hypocrite I am. I have not exited consumer culture. I don't think it's possible. We have set up our little community in ways that have some scaffolding to help me make slightly different decisions. So, we only buy furniture secondhand or given away or picked up off the street. And that's been really fun and weird and sort of created relationships locally that we wouldn't have got if we'd just got everything from IKEA or the fancier version of IKEA. Now I only buy secondhand clothes, and we try and mainly eat vegetarian, and we're trying to grow our own food. But also I buy consumer crap and, fly for work. And there's all these compromises that we're all making. But certainly honestly, it's the bit of me that's a real rebel. Like, the word that came up a lot in the book is resistance. I'm like, I want to resist you trying to form me into a good little consumer. I want to be a citizen of a different kingdom. I want to be someone who is primarily focused on loving God and loving my neighbor, and not doing that with 2% of my brain because I'm so busy shoring up an unstable sense of self through all this activity that we're told we're supposed to do, and we're mimetically reflecting back to us on social media. It's not a healthy story. The Christian story, which is so complex and spiky in places and not cozy, fundamentally feels healthier and more human and more liberatory. And so I'm like, I want to be making decisions that root me in that story, because I think I will be becoming more the kind of person I want to be and more the kind of person the world needs right now, which is not a good little consumer who is just panicking and tribal and defensive.
Yeah. I hear you when you say that you feel like you have compromises all over the place, but even that, what you've just said, has marked all the different little changes that you've made in order to get to where you are now. So I honour you for that attempt to resist. Maybe I'll ask one more question.
It's totally fine.
What are your hopes for the book? Who do you want it to get into the hands of?
If I could contribute like a tiny amount to changing the story that we tell, changing the social permissions for wanting depth and wanting existential satisfaction and wanting meaning and wanting to really belong somewhere, that would be brilliant. If I could close the gap a little bit between my experience of the Christian tradition and the public narrative around it, if I could just bring them together a little bit, that would be great. It's really hard for someone who's not a Christian to pick up a book like this. They have some good reasons to be skeptical that they will not be preached at or judged, or it won't be full of jargon that doesn't make any sense to them. There are good reasons that most books written by Christians are not read by those outside the church. And I really want to design something that could be read by people outside the church and be a blessing to them at whatever level. So people reading it outside the church. And I think for the Christians who pick it up, if they come away feeling able to be a bit more free and a bit braver and a bit more honest than they always feel allowed to be, that would make me happy too.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Yes, and thank you to Elizabeth Oldfield for such a rich conversation. Her book, Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times, is very, very good. Can I encourage you to rush out and buy a copy? You can also follow Elizabeth on Instagram and X. But yeah, the book is wonderful. Please do start there.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone else who might like it, and leave us a rating or review. It helps more people discover us at Life and Faith. And thanks as always to our producer, the Fully Alive, Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
We belong to a political party because we believe things. We should not believe things because we belong to a political party. Your party membership does not require you to sign over your conscience to every jot and tittle of the party platform. You're actually there to influence the party platform.